Hello, everyone from the Educator Collaborative. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are going to get right into the presentation because unfortunately I'm a little low on battery life, but we are very excited to be here with you today. I'm Julia Torres. This is my friend Henan Leichi. I will let him introduce himself while I am sharing the slides.
I'm Henan Leichi, currently working in Lisbon area, Portugal, as Director of Library and Information Services. And I've been managing two library spaces at the same time. So
And one
excited to be giving this presentation. I'm looking forward to hearing your feedback later on.
Yes, one of the reasons that I wanted to introduce you all to Henan is because we started presenting together when we were doing something for Global T-Shares. So today we're going to give you a little bit more of the information that we didn't get to talk about in that presentation, but that we're both very passionate about and that we both really like very much. We plan to continue to do more work together in the future. So think of this as an introduction to our interests and to the world of librarianship if you're curious about more about it. And without further ado, here we go. This presentation is called Librarianship and Literacy Instruction, Imagining Intersections. You probably heard other titles from the Educator Collaborative. The most important thing that you understand is that we're going to be talking today about critical media literacy and different ways to get students to bring out the stories that are within them. Okay, Hanan, do you want to tell them a little bit about where you are, and then I'll tell them about where I am?
Sure. I'm currently working at Tassis Portugal, which is a chain of four schools. We have one in Switzerland, one in London, one in Puerto Rico, and the Portugal campus is the newest one. It opened 2 years ago, and I was hired in 2021 to manage the two library spaces they have here and be their Director of Library and Information Services.
And I'm working in Denver Public Schools as a 10th grade language arts teacher. I was a school librarian for several years, and I'm currently working on completing my MLIS so that I can explore more opportunities in the world of librarianship. You can find us on social media at Julia Aaron 80 or at 293 Henan. So feel free to live tweet if any of this information is exciting or interesting to you. And of course, join it to the Educator Collaborative hashtag for our spring gathering. You can find more information about us on our websites, juliaetorres.com, or Henan can be found on LinkedIn. All right, so today's outcomes are that we're going to brainstorm ideas for critical media literacy instruction. We're going to develop lesson ideas for story creation and dissemination. And we're going to help you consider ways to decenter text-based storytelling and introduce visual and oral storytelling traditions to your students. We thought we'd both tell you a little bit about this slide. You know, when we learn about library science, we learn about oral storytelling traditions and text-based storytelling. A lot of what we do is the collection, dissemination, preservation, organization of information, and that includes stories. But visual storytelling is a part of that too. So we're going to talk just a little bit about some ways that you all can bring visual storytelling and the collection of your students' visual stories and oral stories and the preservation of those for future generations as well. Do you have anything to add, Hanan?
No, I just wanted to highlight that oral storytelling is a big part of it, especially in cultures that are not from the Western world. So I'd say Asia and the Middle East.
Yeah, absolutely. So I love decentering the Western European view of what a story actually is and broadening it to add storytelling traditions from around the world. So first we'll start talking about critical media literacy. What does it look like across grade bands? I'll let Hanan cover this one since my specialty is secondary and middle grades.
In elementary, what we try to accomplish with our students is to highlight the importance of differentiating and distinguishing the type of resources and sources of information that they will be looking when they're doing a research project. For instance, when you look at news, I introduce them to this.
It's okay. Keep going. It's okay.
Okay. I introduced them to a news outlet that mimics a print newspaper at first, and then I converted into the digital format so they can see where each type of information will be located in that newspaper, and then we explore features such as polls, games, or even short, video clips on a current topic. Um, I also focus on teaching them how to choose their keywords or terms when they're searching. Usually, they tend to write a whole question um, on a database or on a discovery tool, and we teach them how to choose the right keyword so they can retrieve the information that they need at that moment. I also encourage them working on reading current events or news. And this is a warm up activity that I do in every single lesson. I ask them to read for 10 consistent minutes individually without talking so they can actually think and reflect on what they're reading. Ideally, elementary students um, would have to read and initiate conversations to discuss those current topics. Sometimes parents tend to um, want to overprotect their children on talking about certain topics, such as the current war that we're seeing in Ukraine. Some parents they don't want their kids to read about it, or they don't want their kids to be exposed to books that talk about wars in general. But we need to initiate those conversations to open up their minds to what's happening around them and outside their bubble.
Absolutely. I love what you said about keywords because I think that one of the things I notice in older students is often their ability to choose the right language in order to initiate searches is limited. So we either wind up providing the language for them or they rely on some kind of other random list. So it's really good to start developing those skills earlier so that they are able to conduct more nuanced and specific searches to get more in-depth information, and then they can apply the criticality skills, which is why we introduced them in middle school to things like the CRAP test. And you can literally put that acronym into your browser, and many resources for the CRAP test will show up. They help you learn or help students learn a process for evaluating the sources that they find to determine things like audience and relevance. And this helps with the development of their critical consciousness as they're navigating this world that really is an information age where they can access just about any information that they want to know about anything these days. And then also we help them evaluate text to determine fact versus opinion. That is really important in the middle grades to know the difference between someone's motive for creating something and the format that that might take, as it could be biased very strongly in form of their opinion versus neutral facts that anybody could and should use. And then I'll let Hanan talk a little bit more about introducing the idea of subject headings and media bias, as well as focusing on media literacy selection and evaluation.
Yes, so by introducing them to subject headings, it's a continuation of the process we started teaching them on how to choose a keyword. Then they know what a subject analysis is. And the way I like to facilitate this process is by helping them create concept mind maps. There are several apps online that you can use, and they're free, that you teach the students how to draw conclusions or write notes on a specific topic, and then they just branch out to see what keywords are connected to that, and then they see the subject headings which are the specific terms or what some librarians call a control part of a controlled vocabulary. Going on media literacy selection, the students tend to want to find their sources immediately. They don't want to take a long time to find just the right source. And the way I teach them to be patient and look for different sources is you need to find, what I suggest to them is finding at least 3 or 4 different sources from authors from completely different opinions. The other way I do this is, and the way I ask them to investigate if whether those authors are biased or not, is look into their background. So I ask them to look for their credentials, whether they're researchers or just journalists or professors or teachers, and if their education has influenced on the manner that they write their articles. The way they evaluate them is also connecting to the credentials of the author and how strong that source would be for their paper. How much evidence they can actually extract from that source and draw conclusions later on.
Yeah, all of those are such valid points, especially because going back to what you said earlier about students getting impatient and being, urgent to just find the very first or even the third link on Google. That's what they like to use. They'll just go to the first page of Google, do a quick search, try to take the first 3 that show up. That's not what we want. We want to make sure that we take the time to teach them to evaluate. And I love what you said about ensuring that they have at least 3 to 4 good sources. And then from there, they can go about the process of learning to evaluate them to see if they're actually sources that are going to be helpful, valuable, reputable, not just representing the same perspective or even the same geographic location, because those are all nuances that we need to teach them to look for. So in high school, they will continue to read more complex current events pieces and evaluate them. I like to use something called Gale resource databases because they have a couple of different databases, one called Resources in Context, and then one that allows them to see opposing viewpoints, I believe is what it's called. Gale is expensive, so if your district doesn't have a subscription to it, you might just try it just to see if it's something that would be useful to you. And then I'll let Henan talk a little bit more about the day.
Yes, the day is a great resource if you want to start teaching them how to read news. It goes from grades through to grade 12. The students seem to love it because of the layout and how everything is positioned for them. It changes every day. So sometimes there are polls, sometimes there are games, sometimes there are video clips on the homepage. You just have to help them, discover and explore it. So usually I give 15 to 20 minutes of my lesson for them to just explore, pick an article. Sometimes the article has highlighted words that will take them to a hyperlinked dictionary and show the definitions of those words, or sometimes the article will be connected to another article that will complement that idea. So I highly recommend you subscribing to The Day. It's not an expensive subscription. It comes from the UK, but they do have an international version too, if you don't want to get just news from the UK.
Awesome. Thank you so much for introducing us to that. That's one that I did not know about. I think that the only other thing on this slide that we didn't talk about is developing a critical media literacy vocabulary. And that kind of overlaps with the social justice vocabulary, right? Because we need to know things about words like decentering and marginalization and erasure. We need to look for the language of social media when we are, or not social media, but the language of social justice, when we are looking for articles that may or may not represent a view of a certain topic that is first presented to us, because typically the dominant culture will represent their views first, which is why we also have something called, in the US, there's the media bias chart, which helps us to look at all of the major news outlet sources in the United States. And this is a link that you all can search later, but it's just called the media bias chart by Fontes, I believe, Fontes. and it shows a bell curve with the most neutral news outlets in the middle, and then some that are skewed right and skewed left on either side. So if you're international, you may have a tool like that, but if you don't, you can always check out the Fontes media bias chart. Which brings us to a quote from our beloved Librarian of Congress here in the United States, Carla Hayden, which I'm not actually here in the United States right now. I am in Portugal with Renan. So we are just showing tribute to Carla Hayden because she has done so much for libraries and for the field of library and information science in one corner of the world. She says, libraries are a cornerstone of democracy where information is free and equally available to everyone. People tend to take that for granted and they don't realize what is at stake when that is put at risk. The reason that we like this quote is because we want to help you understand that critical media literacy is not just a skill that students need to be able to pass some competencies, but this truly has the possibility to impact the rest of their lives. Do you have anything to add, Hanan?
Yes. People, they just think that, just to compliment, that libraries will always be there and that, oh, I can always go back. I can always go there, but they don't actually show up. And some people don't really get to know the library as this great place with resources and place for you to connect with other people and initiate, conversations that will take to bigger projects to help their communities or even their countries. So sometimes it's good to look for libraries or community spaces around you and try to, communicate and connect with those people, because it can make changes not just in your neighborhood, but in your own country as well.
Absolutely. Okay, so we're going to transition now to the second part of this presentation, where we will talk a little bit more about story creation and dissemination by students that they can use to fuel the pursuit of justice. Okay, so we are here talking about story creation across bands, and we'll start with elementary.
So in elementary, before we even start the process of creating and writing stories, we introduce them to the tool they will be using to actually type in their stories in. So we introduce them to a word processing software. We show them all features, of course, taking breaks and asking them to practice that skill with short sentences or a paragraph before they even start brainstorming their stories. And one of the things that we also do is introducing them to comic strips. We read a bunch of graphic novels. We focus on analyzing them. Then we look for other apps that will help us create those. And we also use Flipgrid to do the same, exposing them to different tools and make them be critical thinkers and writers. I think the basic thing for elementary students is to understand the structure of this writing process. It's not a linear process. It goes back and forth. Sometimes you begin writing the introduction, then you stop, and then you write the middle of the story. You go back to the introduction because the middle didn't make sense. Then you go to the conclusion, and then you see if everything is cohesive, right? And then go back to the writing conventions, punctuation, and all of that. I think what elementary students tend to do when they're working on any type of assignment that they have to present to someone is they just want to get it done. They don't want to review it and revise it several times. They don't want to work on their craft. And I think that's something that we have to keep insisting with our students. Nothing is perfect at once. We have to keep going back and asking other peers to, proofread or give us feedback so we can move on.
Right, and that's a process that definitely continues throughout your education, right? Wanting your feedback from your peers, helping to make sure that what you're saying is relevant and applicable to the world that you're living in now and not just something that's biased or time specific. So in middle grade, of course, we do more complex word processing, continuing to work with comic strips and Flipgrid. And there are many apps online that allow for people to do those things. I've used something called ThingLink as well, which we can talk more about later, but it allows them to take a photograph or an image online, and then they can sort of annotate the image with different dots to represent their thinking, or even make up their own story about different elements of the picture using annotations. So I would say introduction of annotations might be something that we left off in middle grade, because when we are creating our own stories and giving peer feedback, that process of writing little notes to the side or just adding comments into a Google Doc, that's definitely part of the more complex word processing that they'll do. So we build advanced elements of the craft of writing into their writing practice, which is crucial at this stage. More than just understanding the structure of the writing process or the structure of story creation, but we can introduce things like in media res, or introduce things like a nonlinear storytelling format, or introduce the different types of characters and the roles that they might serve in story creation. Do you want to talk about high school, Hanan?
Yeah. In high school, students are so excited about social media. And I think one of the ways that we could, grab their attention and stimulate them and encourage them to create stories is through TikTok, Animoto, even Instagram stories and Reels. The thing is, they must understand what the limit could be, right? About sharing the stories and the personal stories. Sometimes they're creating stories out of nowhere, but sometimes they're sharing their personal stories. So they need to understand how much they can share and how much they can't. And social media, once it's published, you can't really delete. So there's an element of teaching them about digital citizenship, and that the audience that they will be sharing their stories with may not be friendly, so they may get some pushback, especially when they're talking about topics such as racism or white supremacy, anything related to social justice, because not everyone may not agree with them, right? Do you want to add anything to it, Julia?
I'll just say that I like the idea of getting them to think about using their own stories to help shine a light on or support other folks who may not have the platform that they have, or who may not have the type of lifestyle that they have. One that comes to mind immediately is an American Indian girl who lives up in either Northern Canada or Alaska. And she has done a lot of educating through TikTok and through AJ Plus and through Instagram about Native Americans, her specific tribal affiliation, cultural practices. She does a lot to try to kind of unravel some of the prejudices and misconceptions about her people. So I think that social media can be a really powerful tool for helping young people engage in the larger conversations about liberation, representation, equity, unlearning some of the prejudicial ideas that we've had from the past. All right, next slide. So I'll just speak a little bit locally about how young people are interacting with stories. We talked about viral videos and about Twitch. I recently learned about Twitch from my son, actually, because he does a lot of gaming. So he will stream his gaming on Twitch, and he can get people who are watching his gaming channel from all over the world, which is really important to him. So I think just the story of his development as a gamer is one that could be captured, but also the story of gaming and its evolution or prevalence in our society. I know that Twitch can be used for other things. I'm just not as familiar with it, but recognizing that it's a very valid form of
storytelling and communication that young people are using, and including that into curriculum, I think has tremendous potential. Also, as we talked about, TikTok and Instagram Reels are ways that young people are learning about what it means to be young all over the world. So we are a global society. They're not just learning about what it means to be on TikTok here in wherever country they are. They're following TikTok users and seeing TikTok stories and Instagram reels from people all over the globe. And then, of course, it's social media based. So it relies on the process of likes and shares, which we should be cautious about, because social media and the people who develop the social media platforms, they're very aware of the part of a young person's brain that develops and thrives on social approval. So a lot of what happens on social media happens to solicit social approval. It's present in adults, but it is very much vulnerable and developing in young people. So having those conversations with them to at least make them aware of the fact that their biological need for social approval is being exploited by companies, I think is a really important conversation, a critical conversation to have with them.
Internationally, the way I see it, I see the students are more consumers than story creators or producers. They may be producing some things, but I'm not aware that that's happening in schools, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like that they're reading more stories of other international kids than just someone from a specific country, or I'd say an English speaking country. And I think that's really important to highlight, because then we don't have the centralization of certain cultures online as well. I remember that when I was working in the UAE, United Arab Emirates, the students were showing videos on kids from India doing, you know, dancing and sharing this personal stories regarding social issues, or somebody doing this from China. So I appreciate seeing the students interested in topics that are not totally centered in the United States or in England, since these are countries that already have lots of publicity and attention.
Mm-hmm. Yep, absolutely. And at the very bottom, we just said in both settings, young people have a hard time getting matched with the right book. So that's still a focus of librarianship, making sure that young people can find the right book that matches their interests, but that will continue to spark that lifelong love of reading just throughout their lifetime. So I'm still focused on making sure that no matter how long it takes, no matter how much searching we have to do, the people in my community will find books that are interesting to them and that they can commit to starting and finishing, so that we don't just become a society of people who are only able to just take bites out of certain texts without reading the entire thing.
Yeah, I'd like to add that I compare choosing just the right book to going to your restaurant and finding your favorite dish. I tell my students it takes time. You're not going to go to a restaurant and look at the menu and pick right away something unless you already know that restaurant pretty well, right? So the way I do it is experiment different dishes, experiment different books. You don't have to read them all. Sometimes you get to read 3 or 4 books at the same time. That's okay too. Some students have a hard time with that concept of, you know, a book can complement another, even if they're not written by the same author. But sometimes the topics and subjects, they are related, and they do highlight each other, or sometimes they're opposing views, and you just have to, you know how to make them talk to each other. So that's how I try to encourage my students to choose the right book.
I love that approach. All right, let's move forward. So we have this really cool quote. I would love for you to read it if you're willing.
Yes. So this quote says, a school librarian's primary duty is to provide learners with intellectual tools that allow them and autonomous and creative use of circulating information in society, and fulfilling and activating function of thought. This quote complements the previous one by Hayden. And we want to highlight and show to our students and learners the importance of seeing the information circulate, but not just one point of view. We should always look at multiple point of views and discuss and talk about it, because if we don't talk about it, it's just isolated, right?
Mm-hmm. Which is one of the reasons that we are here today, because we want to make sure that we're not just staying in our bubbles of knowledge and information, but that we're continually seeking voices from outside of our environment. And I really appreciate that about you, because I know that you have connections both within library science and education all over the world. And I think that from my perspective, that can only make someone a better educator and literacy practitioner. Okay, next slide. So how do libraries function as places of story creation and dissemination? If you're taking notes right now, you might want to separate it into a couple of different columns. We're going to give you some ideas for how libraries can function as places of story creation and dissemination.
So a few ideas that we came up with are podcasting. It's interesting to start like a podcast club. It doesn't have to be something huge. And the production can be as simple as using simple free apps to record yourself or your students. The other way of doing it is having a YouTube show. The thing I would like to bring to your attention here is in several school districts, there is this worry about child protection and everything. So please make sure that you have a permission slip from your parents or their guardians, and make sure that you have all the documentation that would, prove that you're doing something that is legit, that is totally educational, because in the future, if you don't have those documentations, then you may get in trouble. So it's good to have everything documented, properly documented. Sometimes it's good to have a huge book club happening when we choose one book and the whole school reads the same book, not necessarily the same edition or same version. We have some books that go throughout elementary school, middle school, and high school, and they're written according to their reading levels. Have community book clubs or culture food night. I remember that in several schools I've worked at, we had international days, and then it was surrounded by literary, culinary, and that was amazing. Public speaking competitions. I know that my school is organizing one for the next month, and the students get to talk about their experiences or write short stories, write poem, and share with the community. And there is a rubric that they are, graded on. And most of the times we have multiple winners. That's a good way to get the community involved into writing and sharing their stories. We also would like to highlight slam poetry, which is slightly different than the public speaking competitions. If you're aware of that, if you're not, look it up. It's an amazing way to share poetry in a dynamic way. And youth published anthologies. Usually in every single international school I've worked at, teachers tend to publish quote unquote books within their classes. And they want to bring to the library so the other classes can check them out. So this is a good way for you to keep stories circulating in your own community. Julia, do you want to add anything to it?
I'll just say that there are many different ways to add these anthologies to your official library collection. And I would recommend that people work closely with their school librarians if you have one, with your district librarian if you don't have one, because there is a specific way to add items to the collection. It's not just a matter of putting them on the shelf. So I would recommend that. And then as far as slam poetry goes, As we know, some of the more famous slam poets are people like Elizabeth Acevedo and Mahogany Brown. They have books that could then open up the window to conversations about slam poetry in your community. So yeah, okay.
So we are going to talk a little bit now about sharing stories. So more ideas to share stories beyond our immediate environments. And really what we want you to think about are just some new, perhaps new to you, expansive ways to think about sharing stories that students create. Next slide. So this is my friend, Alicia Cardenas. She is a local Denverite. She was a local Denverite. Tragically, she was killed just before 2022. In December of 2021, a man dressed in a security uniform, a white man, who had written a book about killing her, went into her indigenous woman-owned business and he shot her. And so the reason that I wanted to talk a little bit about her today is because, number one, her body was artwork that was very symbolic. And those of you who are familiar with the art of tattooing understand that every tattoo has a story. Many of our students have tattoos or have family members that tell tattoos. And that is not just something that we do for aesthetics, but it is also something spiritual. So Alicia was an indigenous activist. I like to honor her life with her sharing her story as much as I can. And she also left her mark on Denver by leaving murals in various places throughout the city. So this is just one mural that she did that shows some indigenous iconography. And in the caption, you can see this Denver mural provides some context for indigenous history of Denver. It was created by a local person as a visible reminder of the ongoing fight for social equality. So something that I think would be a worthwhile activity for young folks to do is take a look at the murals, graffiti, and local artwork by local people around their cities. So this is just one example of someone who was very special and important to me, who made a mark on my city for her indigenous activism. And then, you know, just an example, she's a very visible example of a graffiti artist, but also a visual artist, a muralist who told her stories through a visual medium. And something to think about is the fact that we know of some other visual artists like Banksy, for example, is one that lots of people know about. But there are visual artists in every city who are making their mark in public spaces and helping young folks to know their background, know their stories, and know the stories that the visual arts tell is a really important way to encourage some of our young people who are more visual artists to tell their stories in that medium as well. Okay.
This is a segue to another topic, or oral storytelling traditions, that also connects with what Julia just said. It's a different way of reflecting on consciousness, providing entertainment to an audience on a different medium, and focusing on verbal imagery. So an example in the Arab world is that the students, before they start reading, they tell or hear stories from their ancestors, or they retell stories that their ancestors shared with them. And then they start reading. So I remember when I was working in the UAE, in the United Arab Emirates, students were not really into reading, especially the Emirati kids, because they were used to hearing the stories out loud, which is a great thing that we usually do in libraries. But I completely changed that community by introducing them to written stories, regular books. Also, I introduced them to using audiobooks and connecting back to publishers that they would recognize in the Arab world.
And I love the idea that you and I talked a little bit about when we found this article about reciprocity, right? Where we deal with the individual's interaction with their surroundings, as well as the influence of the surroundings or the society on the individual. So if we wrap this around through oral storytelling traditions and visual storytelling traditions, it's important for us to remember and to help students be conscious of the ways that the visual and oral storytelling traditions that they grew up with are having an impact on them, just as they are contributing to them as well. Okay, so here's some ideas for sharing. Henan, you want to go for it first, and then I'll add on?
Sure. So one of the ways you can do this using technology would be digitizing self-published items through your OPAC, your online catalog. Do read aloud records that helped a lot during the pandemic of famous audiobooks. One example of it, if you don't want to do it yourself, there's an example called Storyline Online. Several elementary teachers took advantage of that and try to mimic the same idea of reading aloud and showing illustrations that moved by digital effects. Critical commentary analysis, while they read a book, the students get to read a book with their teachers, but they go deeper into analyzing the illustrations and the way that the author chose specific words to present a specific social issue. QR codes to share resources and reviews. I've seen librarians using this as a market strategy on books that students wouldn't necessarily check out at first. So they would scatter QR codes around with students talking about their experiences reading those books. Julia, do you have anything to add on this?
I think that that's a great way to get young people to hear the voices of other young people recommending titles. So it's not always coming from the adults. And going back to what we were talking about earlier in terms of student published work that we actually catalog and incorporate into the collection, I think it would be even greater to have students who then read those collections of stories giving their feedback on those. You can record it using a website called, I think it's still in operation. It is, I'm drawing a blank on the name of it right now, but there are lots of websites where you can just create a sound clip and it will create just a link. And then you put that link into the QR code generator. And I thought I used to use one, I can't remember the name of it right now, but I'll find it in the future and I'll post it. But there are various websites, like I said, where you can just record your voice and it will create an MP4 or MP3 document, but it will also give you a link. And that's the link that you put into the QR code generator. And then the students can give their 2-minute or even 30-second review of a book. And I think that it's very helpful for students to hear from one another versus always hearing from adults recommending titles for them.
Yeah, and I think we should.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say Genius Lyrics is a place where you can see that natural incorporation of what users think about songs through annotation and through the notes that other people put in the margins and at the bottom of the songs. And then wikis. If you have a student who loves, for example, Vampire Diaries, there is a wiki for Vampire Diaries. There's a wiki for The Witcher. There's a wiki for Game of Thrones. There are wikis for all kinds of different fandoms, and then fan fiction also to go along with it. My daughter recently told me that there is a whole group of fan fiction written based on Outlander, but it like takes different parts of Outlander and puts them in different time periods. So there's all kinds of fan fiction that is collaborative co-creation of stories as well that we should explore and really know a little bit more about, rather than just saying, oh, that belongs on the fringes because it deals with topics that we are unfamiliar with or uncomfortable with talking about. here are some stories that resonate. And we put these in here because we like these, but also because we know that people are always going to love the sharing of titles. So I will just leave these up here just for a second. These are some stories that have resonated with me of late. And what I like about them are that they all involve young people and kind of their take on the world that they live in. You can read about the young Ibiza younger Ibiza boy, but it focuses on Octavia Butler's childhood and growing up in Star Child, and it's a novel in verse. The Door of No Return talks about a young person in colonial West Africa who is dealing with the slave trade. So you can read a little bit more about that. It's told in verse, but it also deals with what life was like for people in West Africa pre being brought into enslavement. And then Tales of a Feathered Serpent, of course, is going to deal with some what we might refer to as mythology or folklore, in addition to how folks might have integrated it into their ethos and into the way that they operate and see the world. The Magic Fish is similar in that regard, in that it deals with a young person who is questioning his sexuality and trying to figure out how to have that conversation with parents. But the powerful thing about the Magic Fish is it has colors that are representative of emotions and different states of being, and that color imagery or symbolism is an extended motif that goes throughout the story, and it's a graphic novel. So highly recommend these for different ways of approaching storytelling that is rooted in the real world but still has the fantastic or the imaginative woven throughout.
And I'm bringing the 57 Bus, which is a Stonewall Book Award awarded book by Bosco Slater. It's not a novel in verse, even though I like reading novels in verse. It's a story about two characters. One is white and one is black. One of them transitioned from being a boy to a girl. So there's all that conversation behind multiple genders and how to address people and how they want to be addressed. And these two characters, they meet in a tragic event. One sets the other one on fire. So that's a really interesting story. The second one is a novel in verse, as well as the third one. Jason Reynolds wrote this beautiful book about this boy who lost his brother, and he is reminiscing that story inside an elevator. So as you can see on the book cover, you see every single floor, and as soon as he goes down to each floor, he has different characters visiting him in the elevator and reminding him how much he loved his brother. And Full Cicada Moon by Marilyn Hilton is about this African Japanese girl who is moving into a completely white community, and she has to deal with her blackness and her Japanese heritage in a place where she's not that welcomed. So she wants to be a scientist, and people don't believe in her. They think that she's weird, that she doesn't talk English the same way the other kids do speak. It's a quite interesting book about accepting different cultures and differences within the United States.
So the bottom line, right, is that this work has the potential to transform the world, not only helping young folks create stories, but also helping young folks see the stories that are around them in the worlds that they live in. And we know through the power of libraries that that is one thing that we specialize in, is helping young people get connected to the right story, but also hopefully with Hanan joining us from an international perspective. I know that the Educator Collaborative is global, and we are hopeful that people will connect to the stories around them, not just in the little pockets where they live, but be expansive and look outside to story creation and forms of dissemination that are different than those that you may have grown up with or have known about. Any other thoughts you want to add, Hanan? You can find us at Go ahead. Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, you can find us on at Julia Aaron 80 at 293 Hanan. To complement your idea on that, I think international students, they do tend to look outside the boxes by themselves because they live in different places, right? So they get to experience other cultures in different environments. They travel a lot, so it's easier for them to hear or create other stories because they're exposed to that different environment.
Absolutely. And we have a little QR code here that should take you to the pre-order page for Liven Up Your Library. If you're looking to know more about library science and a little bit more about the intersections between library science and school librarianship, then this is a place where you can do that. Hanan and I have also talked about co-authoring some papers going forward. So you can look for those. We will be doing more together for sure. So please follow us on social media and reach out to us with any questions. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for your time, and we hope that it was valuable for you.
Thank you so much, and we're looking to receiving your feedback and questions, either about this presentation itself or any other topic that you saw being relevant to your community.
Thank you.
So,